Hello and welcome to this tutorial on academic writing. As you know, this is a writing intensive class. That's a general education designation that is there to make sure that students at some point during their university career learn how to write academic essays. Now, I think that the right way to approach that is to teach you not just how to write academic papers, but how to make your writing better in general. And I'll say quite a bit today about how to make your writing better. But I'll start by explaining why it's a good idea for you to do so. I'll proceed by going through these 11 topics. That's quite a few. This is a fairly lengthy presentation. If you want to break it up, probably the best way to do that will be to watch the first 3 sections, maybe the first 4 sections, and then 5 through 8, and then 9 through 11. The meaty part of it is going to be in sort of the middle. But I think all of it's important. Now, you might want to watch it more than once. You might want to bookmark it on your browser so that you can find it later when you're looking for advice. Don't forget, too, that YouTube creates a transcript of all of these videos. And so if you want to download the transcript, you can do that. Obviously, that won't be formatted in a very nice way, but it's at least a place to start. And you could get some advice there from reading essentially what I'm saying out loud during the video. Okay, so let's turn to the first section, which is your motivation. What is your motivation for becoming an excellent writer? Or to put it another way, why should you care? Why should you spend the time to learn about good academic writing and good writing in general? The first and perhaps most obvious answer to that is that the better you are at writing, the more success you're going to have in college. As you know, a large number of your college assignments involve writing to some degree, whether that's in blog posts or discussion boards or short writing assignments or longer essays or lab reports. There's all kinds of different ways that you'll do writing in college. And the better you are at writing, the better you'll do on those assignments. Now, that's partly because if you're good at writing, you're going to be better able to express your ideas. In other words, take 2 different people who have equally good ideas, one of whom's a better writer than the other, you would expect the better writer to end up with better results. So presumably you want to put yourself into that camp where you're going to get better results and do better in college. Those writing skills that you learn for success in college are going to do you well in the rest of your life as well. We call writing a transferable skill, which means that it's not subject matter dependent. If you learn to write well in whatever academic discipline, that's also going to make you a better writer in every other area of your life too. So that usually means that if you're a good writer in college, you're going to be more hireable. You're going to be more likely to get that first job. Now, that is in part going to be because you do a better cover letter, or you answer the application questions in a way that's more convincing or makes you look better. But it could also be that once you're in a job, you're going to be more hireable in the sense of getting the next promotion. So that's one of the big advantages that people who have college degrees have, is that they're much more likely to get promotions and move into higher level positions. Obviously, that's where the money is, right? There's much more money in being a manager than there is in being on the floor, so to speak. There's also often an opportunity to avoid dangerous work or to avoid work that is repetitive. And sometimes those other positions, those management and upper level positions, are going to be things that you might personally find more fulfilling. So if that's a track that you imagine yourself going on, or at least you want to leave open to yourself, then becoming an excellent writer in college is going to put you in good stead, as they say, to be able to achieve that later in your career. Now, why is that? Well, it's because a large part of our economy today is what we call the information economy. And exchanging of information happens online almost exclusively in business through writing. So you might be writing employee evaluations, or you might be writing sales reports, or you might be writing a projection about some future plan and how that's going to work out. Maybe you're writing to convince people in your organization to do something. Maybe you're writing to a government agency to apply for a grant or some sort of program that would help your company. So there's lots and lots of different ways that writing will be involved in your careers, and the better you get at it now, the more successful you're going to be in your career because of it. Now, there are other kinds of reasons to become a good writer too that are less, you might say, employment focused. They're not just about having a career and making money, and you can see those in the last two bullet points here. I think that being a good writer is an excellent thing because it allows you to take full part in democracy. You can write opinion letters to the editor of newspapers. You can take part in online debates and make your point in a much more persuasive way. And they're write to your senators and so on. And if you're a good writer, you're much more likely to be effective in those political activities. So I think that's another reason that we don't often talk about, but which is nevertheless important for why you ought to think about trying to become an excellent writer. Now, for some people, writing is a very fulfilling activity. I will admit that it's also sometimes very painful. It's an arduous process. Sometimes it can be really boring. Sometimes it can be just plain hard work. And that can be a reason that causes people to sort of pull away from it or to decide not to do it. But if you push through that kind of pain and make yourself an excellent writer, then later on you might find that writing is a kind of personal therapy. It's fulfilling to you. It allows you to express yourself artistically. It allows you to communicate your ideas to other people. And many people find that extremely fulfilling. In fact, there are some people who find it to be the most important part of their lives. And so that's possibly you. And you should give yourself the opportunity to experience that kind of joy by making yourself an excellent writer while you're in college. Now, I'm talking about developing yourself as a writer in college, but we should point out that becoming an excellent writer is a lifelong pursuit. It's not something you're ever going to be finished doing. You should always be thinking about how to make your writing better. And that's true for me. I've been writing for a long, long time. I'm 50 years old now as I create this lecture. I've been a professor since, 20 years now. And I'm always learning new things about writing. So don't think that you can be done with learning to do writing. It's the sort of thing that you're always working towards. Okay, so let's get into some details, but before we do that, let's talk a little bit about some background concepts, some things that make learning writing a little bit more clear, because it sort of sets the ground and helps you to understand what it is that we're aiming at when we're trying to become excellent writers. The first point is, I think, crucial, and that is that writing is thinking. And this goes both ways. Being a good writer makes you a better thinker, and being a good thinker makes you a better writer. Now, why is this important to mention? Well, in part because I think we all recognize that being a better thinker definitely has advantages. People who are better able to solve problems, who are better able to persuade others to do what they want, better able to gather reasons and evidence and so on. People who are identified in that way as good thinkers, we tend to think of as being more successful and often happier. And becoming a better writer makes you a better thinker. And that's because it forces you to explain your ideas clearly, to make sure that your ideas are cogent, that they make sense, and can sometimes help you to find problems in your thinking, because being able to write your ideas clearly requires you to think them clearly first. All right, so this is a feedback loop, right? Becoming a good writer makes you a better thinker. Becoming a better thinker makes you a good writer. You could call that a virtuous circle or an upward spiral where you're constantly improving. A related point is that writing is communicating. What's the point of writing? It's to express ideas, to explain things to people, to convince people of things. All of those activities involve communication. And if you're ineffective at communication, then you're going to be less able to achieve those kinds of goals and those kinds of outcomes. So writing, if you're good at it, means that you're good at communicating. Now, why is that? Well, if you're good at writing, that means you'll say exactly what you mean to say in the best way for your audience to hear, understand, and be persuaded by it. And so if you say exactly what you mean, well, then the idea is clear and it's much more likely to be transmitted to the other person. And if you're saying it in the best way that you can, then your audience is, first of all, more likely to pay attention. Secondly, more likely to understand. And third, more likely to be persuaded. So writing is communicating. That means that you are packaging your ideas in the correct way to make sure that your idea is getting across. So you could think of writing then as an act of service in a way. It's not really for you, it's for your readers. The better you are at writing, the more your readers are going to get out of what you've written. So this is not necessarily for you, right? It's for them. It's for your audience. Now that's true whether you're talking about in college or in other places. In college, it's a little bit strange because it's a bit artificial, right? You're writing for a professor who probably knows more about the topic than you do, who probably has more experience writing than you do, and who probably isn't really your audience, right? You just sort of pretend that your audience is what it is, and your professor is the one who's grading you. So what is your audience? Well, that's one of the things we'll talk about in a few moments. It's a key part of becoming a good writer, is identifying who your audience is and how to write to them. All right, so now we get into some of the meat of the content here, and this is a crucial point. First of all, writing is a skill. We tend to think of people who are good writers as having some kind of natural ability, and there is a little bit of that too. Some people just have language skills, just like some people have basketball skills or artistic skills or musical skills. Some people, there's just variation amongst the human population. Some people have skills or abilities that are higher in some areas rather than others. But since it's a skill, that means that it's something that anybody can learn to do. And in particular, this is a kind of skill that you learn by doing. So to learn by doing means that you practice the thing and you get better at it. It's a kind of thing that you can get better at, is the main point. And the way to get better at it is to practice. You actually have to do the activity in this case to get better at the activity. Now, as you may know, Aristotle describes ethics, or being a virtuous person, as having a certain kind of skill. But when he talks about that, he points out that the skill has a knowledge component. There's an intellectual aspect of knowing what the right thing is. But the most important part of being ethical or having a virtuous character on Aristotle's account is that you have to do the right thing for the right reason in the right way. So it's the doing part that's much more important than the knowing part, according to Aristotle's account of skills. And we can see that through his example of becoming a woodworker or a carpenter or something like that. If you want to get good at woodworking, yes, you could go and read all of the books, but that still wouldn't tell you everything that you need to know. Until you've actually touched the chisel to the spinning wood on the lathe, you don't really know what that's like. You don't really know how to move the chisel to shape the wood in the right way. Right? You don't really know how to make a chair until you've started making one, until you've practiced a few times and you've learned what the pitfalls are and how to make shortcuts and how to correct mistakes and things like that. So the doing is a crucial part of acquiring the skill of being a carpenter or a woodworker, or, as Aristotle says, being a virtuous person. The same analogy holds for writing. It's true that you can learn all the rules, right, have the intellectual knowledge about grammar and citation styles and how to write, how to create a structure for your essay and all that sort of thing. But until you actually do it, you aren't going to be good at it. So writing is something that you have to practice in order to get better at. Now, I gave you some reasons earlier in this presentation about why you should care, right? Why you should be motivated to make yourself an excellent writer. What that should turn into is for you an intention to practice writing as much as you can. The only way to become a better writer is to write. You can't really get to be a better writer just by reading books or listening to videos. You have to go out and actually do the writing. Now, books and videos and other kinds of online sources can help you, right? In particular, they can help you to solve a problem. If you find yourself stuck or you don't know how to deal with something, going to the internet and looking something up can be really helpful. But essentially, you have to do the work. You have to actually do the writing in order to get better at being a writer. Now, one of the very best things that I ever did as a college student when I was an undergraduate was to start keeping a daily journal. And what that led me to do was to write every day. I wrote 1 or 2 pages by hand in a large notebook. And I just kept writing and I kept writing. Most of the time I was writing about things I'd read or things that I'd heard in class or other ideas that I'd had. That's because I was a philosophy student, right? So I had this interest in writing about things from a philosophical point of view. But that wasn't the necessary part of it. The necessary part of it was just writing every day. And it's getting in the habit of expressing yourself that matters. So this brings us to the point about habit in Aristotle's account of becoming virtuous. Right? Aristotle says that in order to become a virtuous person, you have to emulate people who are virtuous. So you ask, what would Buddha do? And then you try to do what the Buddha would do in some situation that you're having an ethical dilemma about. Same thing in writing. Until you are a good writer, you don't necessarily know what good writing is. And so how do you become a good writer? Well, you can start to emulate various other writers who are well regarded. All right, so that's because you want to habituate yourself to the right thing. There's something I heard from a piano teacher a long time ago, and they said, look, if you're practicing a passage and you keep making the same mistake, stop for the day, go away and come back tomorrow and try again. Because if you keep practicing that mistake is going to become ingrained. And the same thing is true with writing. If you're always writing in a sloppy way, then you're going to habituate yourself to being a sloppy writer rather than an excellent writer. So if the only writing you're doing is texting, right, where you're using abbreviations and emojis and you're not really using punctuation or capital letters or even transition words or anything like that, you're using whatever is the most efficient way to express an idea in the fewest number of characters, well, then you're not going to become a good writer. You might be good at texting, right? You might be the very best person at writing in text speech, but you're not really going to be a good writer. So to habituate yourself to the right kinds of writing means to write in the way that an excellent writer would write. But then you have this problem. How do you figure out what excellent writers do? Well, there's some simple things, right? They write in full sentences, they use correct spelling and grammar and punctuation and paragraphs, and they try to organize their thoughts in a coherent way, and they revise what they're writing. So they go back and correct it and make it better than it was the first time. But besides that, you can kind of accelerate your learning in this way by looking to role models. So other writers are your role models for becoming a good writer. Now, it does matter which writers you pick. And how are you going to pick them? Well, you should read a lot. This is a key thing, right? If you're not reading all the time, you're never going to become a good writer. So reading a lot matters to becoming a good writer. Now, there's a side benefit too, of course, which is that you learn a lot. You acquire a lot of information. You become better at empathizing about other people's lives. And in general, you become a more enlightened person. So reading a lot has many advantages. One of them is that it will help you to become a better writer. Okay, now in order for that to happen, you have to be intentional about it. You can't just read whatever. It's true that when somebody's just starting out reading, like a 7- or 8-year-old, and you want to get them excited about reading, you should just give them whatever book they want to read. It doesn't matter if it's high literature or not, right? Just whatever they're interested in, let them read about it, whether it's dinosaurs or unicorns or something else, right? Whatever they want to read about, let them read it. But at your stage, now that you're in college, you need to start making intentional choices about what to read. Now, when you're reading for entertainment, go ahead, read whatever you want. But you should also be intentional about reading other things, and there the quality matters. If you're only reading texts that your friends send you, or only reading Facebook posts or Instagram posts or whatever, you're not going to be reading good literature, right? It's going to be at best sort of mediocre. And more than that, you don't have any sort of guarantee of quality. So one of the things I recommend is that you look for things that are published in reputable places. I think a very good place to start is with the national press. Things like the LA Times, the New York Times, the Atlantic, various other publications like that. I wouldn't start with the New Yorker, that's like really advanced, but work yourself up to it. One of the things that I read a lot in high school and college was Scientific American. And that's a good idea because, first of all, you'll learn a lot about the world, and that's interesting, but it's also written in a fairly rigorous way, you might say. And it's a good idea sometimes to push yourself beyond your current comfort level. right? You currently have a reading level, right, whatever it might be, based on your past experience and how much effort you've put into improving your reading ability. And there are going to be some subject matters and some levels of writing which are a little bit beyond you. Some of them will be a lot beyond you, right? And for those ones that are a lot beyond you, there's almost no point. Like for me, if I go and try to read a book on general relativity, I get almost nothing out of it because I just don't have the math background. But I can read something in the New Yorker, or I can read something in Scientific American, and it's a little bit of a stretch for me, both in terms of what I'm thinking, but also in terms of the writing and reading level. And that's what I want you to think about too, is how to find and acquire reading material that's just a little bit beyond your current comfort level. What that does is it allows you to stretch, allows you to see an ideal that's beyond where you are, and you'll learn new things, right? Both about facts, but also, and maybe more importantly, about how to write and how to express complex ideas in the most efficient and effective way. Now, sometimes writing is difficult because it's bad writing, so watch out for that. Right? Just because it's difficult doesn't mean that it's good writing that you should emulate. So how should you decide what to read? How will you decide if it's good? Well, just like Aristotle says, when you're looking for an ethical role model, you should try to figure out who has the best reputation. And in this case, you can rely on things like the New York Times, for example, the New York Times bestsellers list, or recommended books from the New York Times. There's a paper in England called The Times, also the Times of London. They have the Times literary supplement that would recommend excellent novels and other kinds of books that you could look up. Our library has electronic copies of all these things, by the way. And then other kinds of places where you might find, top 20 best American novels, or top 10 best books in science writing, or whatever's of interest to you, right? Or whatever it is the subject that you're stretching to. But try to make sure that you're reading writing that's recognized as good so that you can emulate it to become a better writer yourself. Now, I think it's important to be realistic about where you really are. Right? What is your reading level? What is your writing level? And what are the next steps that you need to take in order to get where you need to be? Now, becoming a good reader and a good writer is a lifelong quest, but there is a college standard that you should meet before you graduate. And the way that you're going to get there is by working really hard. It's going to involve reading a lot, and not just skimming things with your eyes, but sitting down with a dictionary and a style guide and maybe a thesaurus or an encyclopedia. And every time you encounter something that you don't know, look it up. Right? If there's a word you don't know, look it up in the dictionary and write down the definition for yourself. That does a couple of things, right? It allows you to repeat it, which helps you to improve it in your memory. And then it gives you a list of words that you can, say, look at once a week to improve your vocabulary. All right, so that's something that everybody should do, something that I did a lot when I was in college. I loved my dictionary when I was an undergraduate student, had it with me all the time when I was reading and writing, and it really expands your experience, because now, if you're using the dictionary, you can really understand what people are trying to say. And once you get that depth of understanding, it becomes really exciting and you want more of it. Speaking of dictionaries, there are lots of other resources that you need to be an excellent writer. A good dictionary is the first and most important of these. I strongly recommend that you get a hard copy dictionary, a Webster's or an Oxford English, and not a small one, but a really good one, right? Because there are many different words that are important that you'll encounter in academia that might not be in an ordinary dictionary. And if you try to use just the internet to look up words, you often only get the first or maybe the second of the meanings of words, and you don't get all of the detail. If you're buying a hard copy dictionary, I'd recommend something that has etymology in it. The etymology tells you the history of a word, which can be extremely illuminating to help you to understand what the word means. It's especially true if you're reading historical texts, that being aware of the origin of the word can help you to understand what they meant by the word in an earlier time that might be different than what we mean by it now. But the very best thing that an etymological dictionary does for you is that it teaches you about root words and how words have been combined together over time to form the language that we have now. And that's extremely useful because that means that if you encounter a word that has a similar root, you're going to have a better idea of what it means as compared to if you hadn't, right? So by reading the etymology or the history of how a word came to be what it is, you'll be making yourself a better reader all around. The second thing that most writers get in terms of a hard copy book is a thesaurus. Now, Word and other word processors these days have pretty good thesauruses in them, and you can rely on them pretty well. But a hardback or paperback thesaurus is going to have probably more options in it than what you would find online. The trick about a thesaurus is that you can't use it by itself, because they group words together in a thesaurus by similar meanings, but it's not the case that every word in one list means exactly the same thing. And so you often need a dictionary to look up the details and to make sure which of the words in the list that a thesaurus gives you is exactly the right one. So a dictionary, again, is extremely important, even when you're using a thesaurus. One of the things that I sometimes talk about when I'm talking to students about writing is to avoid thesaurus-itis, which is where you look in a thesaurus to try to find the $20 word to replace the $2 word that you had originally written. And often when that happens, you end up with very grandiose sounding language that doesn't actually mean what you think it means. And thesaurus-itis of that kind, where you're sort of going to the max with fancy words, often undercuts writing rather than making it better. So be very careful about that. Always check the word that you're using from a thesaurus against the dictionary to prove to yourself that it really means what you want it to mean, or what you want to say in that context. By the way, it's often much better to use simpler language rather than more complex language. So don't think that a thesaurus is always about finding the $20 word. Sometimes it's about finding the $2 word that really explains exactly or expresses exactly the idea that you're trying to get across. The third thing that I would buy if I were in a discipline that had a lot of writing in it is a style guide. The one that I used was called Strunk and White. They were the last names of the editors of this book, called I actually can't remember the name of the title of the thing. Everybody just calls it Strunk and White. Well, there are lots of other style guides now. You can find them easily on Amazon or wherever you shop for books. Just look for a writing style guide or a style guide and you'll see many. And what's useful about those is that they'll tell you sort of subtle things that are hard to figure out on your own. Even if you're a voracious reader, you might pick up something sort of by osmosis but not really understand the rules, and a style guide can explain to you what those rules are. So if you're a person who needs to improve their grammar or wants to improve their writing style and make your style as elegant and as powerful as it can be, then a style guide is really something that you should try to get. Now, the other things here are probably things that you don't necessarily need to own, but you should refer to them when you need them. So a citation manual, something like the Chicago Manual of Style or the guidebook for the American Psychological Association citation style, those guidebooks are available online for the first part, for the most part anyway, and then they're also in our library. So you can look those up whenever you need to look something up. You can get those resources. You don't have to own them. If you're going on to do a PhD, then it's worthwhile getting the citation manual for your discipline, but otherwise I wouldn't bother. Of course, you have instructor resources, for example, this video, right, and all the other things that I've posted to our Blackboard page. But there are other things too, other online sources that you can go to get online writing advice, and there's also the Writing Center. Now on campus, the Writing Center is offering Zoom-based writing consultations, and what you need to do is to just get on their website, make an appointment, and send them a piece of your writing, and they'll go through it with you and help you to make it better. It's usually a good idea for you to make that piece of writing as good as you can make it before you send it on to them. That way they don't have to focus on the small stuff like spelling and grammar, and they can focus on the bigger stuff that will make you a more effective writer. You might have noticed there's one other thing I've got on this list, and depending on your discipline, you might need a specialized dictionary. So they have these in literature, for example, or there's in philosophy. Dictionaries of philosophy are very helpful, and there's probably one in psychology, right? So these are just dictionaries that focus on the specialized terminology that's important in a given discipline. So whatever your discipline is, you could think about getting one of those. Certainly if you go on to graduate school, you'll want one, but even as an undergrad, they can be very helpful. They're generally not available online, or at least not very easily obtainable in an online format. So you could, in philosophy, rely on something like the online Encyclopedia of Philosophy or the Stanford Online Encyclopedia of Philosophy. But those aren't quite the same as the kind of dictionary that I'm talking about here, which is just focused on much shorter entries and definitions of terms. Anyway, those are all things that will be helpful to you as you become a better writer. You don't have to use all of them all the time, except the dictionary, but you should use some of them some of the time so that you can improve your writing skills. All right, so next I want to talk about finding your voice. This is something that in some writing advice books and websites you'll see this as sort of a big piece of advice, that you should find your voice as a writer. Now that's good advice for people who are going to be writing fiction or who will be developing a career as a nonfiction writer for a major publication like the New Yorker or the New York Times or the LA Times or some other major publication like that. It's actually less important for people who are not going to be specialized writers in those fields. But you still need to do the thing that's intended by this advice of finding your voice. So let me explain exactly what it means. First of all, to become an excellent writer, you're not just going to have one voice, you're going to have many voices. And I bet you do this in your ordinary life already when you're talking to people. You probably talk to a 3-year-old differently than you talk to an 83-year-old. You probably talk to an authority figure like a judge differently than you talk to your best friend. And so that's something that we all do, right? We call it code switching sometimes if you change the way that you speak from one cultural context to another. And that's something like what you need to do when you're a good writer. So there's a difference between writing for, say, a blog post or a discussion board versus writing an academic paper. And the differences between those three can be described. They're not just sort of random. There's something there that can be studied. So that's what I want to point out to you now. So one of the things that you can think about here is that making yourself an excellent writer is partly making yourself a universal writer. It's making yourself able to write in many different contexts. Because when you need to do writing in your life, it's not going to be always the same kind. And so becoming an excellent writer is like putting a good multi-tool in your toolbox. Sometimes you need a screwdriver, sometimes you need a pair of scissors, sometimes you need an awl. So having all those tools in your toolkit will be helpful to you, right? And that's what you can think about as a writer, is how to build your toolkit so that the next time you need to write something, you have the tools available to do that particular job. All right, now good writers can write in a lot of different ways, not in just one way. So a really good writer isn't just going to be writing detective novels. They might also be able to write scientific papers or blog posts or newspaper articles, right? So there's lots of different kinds of writing, and being an excellent writer means that you're adaptable and you can sort of figure out how to write in each of those areas. Now, you're probably not going to be an expert on every one of those things, right? That would be a very, very difficult thing to do. But being generally able to write in lots of different ways is a good skill to have. Part of what's going on there is that you adjust the way you write to the needs of the case and the circumstances, right? So what is it you're trying to achieve? What are the constraints? Who are you talking to? Why are you doing the writing? Right? All of those things make a difference to the way that you write. And we can break that down into some more detail. The first layer of detail that we should add to this about finding your voice is that there are many different reasons for writing, many different goals that you might have. We could call these your purposes for writing. And you should tailor your writing to the purpose. Right? You shouldn't try to write a blog post the way that you would write an academic paper, and you shouldn't write an academic paper the way that you would write a blog post. Those are different kinds of writing. And part of what's involved there is that there are different conventions for different kinds of writing. We're going to talk quite a bit more about conventions towards the end of this particular video, but for now, just I'm sure it makes some sense to you already intuitively to say that there are different ways of writing for different kinds of purposes. Another difference is that for different kinds of writing, you're going to have different audiences. If you're writing to your grandmother, it's a different kind of writing that you're going to do as compared to writing for your professor or writing for a newspaper. So pay attention to your audience. Who's going to be your reader? And you should tailor your writing, the way that you write, to the audience who will be reading it. Now, what does that mean? Well, different audiences have different background knowledge, right? If you talk to somebody who's a senior in philosophy, they're going to know more about philosophy. And so if you're writing for them, you can assume more, right? You don't have to fill in all the details of the background knowledge. Likewise, people's level of interest in a topic might vary. People who are sort of in a club about that topic will be very interested. People who are not maybe won't be, right? So pay attention to who your audience is and what their level of interest is, and then adapt your writing to that. Now, partly that can mean being brief when you know that your audience isn't interested, or only giving them the really important parts. Or sometimes it can mean finding ways to make them interested, connecting what you're trying to tell them to something that they do care about. Okay, but all of that is being adaptable and taking into account features of your audience and what they know and what they care about to make your writing fit their needs. Right? Likewise, different audiences are going to have different attention spans, language abilities, and so on. Consider a third grader as compared to a junior in college, right? Presumably their attention spans and language abilities are different, so you're going to write differently to those two audiences, even if you're writing about the same things. Now, your audience for an academic paper, right? If you're submitting an essay for a class, what you should do is imagine that the reader is somebody who is well versed in the general subject area, but who's unfamiliar with your specific topic. Okay, so maybe you're writing a paper that has a thesis, right, on a certain author, and you're going to say that that author's argument about some subtopic is correct or incorrect. You can assume that your reader knows the general subject area but doesn't know that particular argument, and so that tells you what kinds of detail you need to fill in, right? So this is partly about what kind of background knowledge you're going to assume for your reader. Now, obviously, of course, in actual fact, your audience is your professor, who is not necessarily that general reader who, that reader who's well versed in the general area but unfamiliar with the specific topic. In fact, your professor might be very familiar with that specific topic, but nevertheless, you kind of have this imaginary audience for an academic essay. Right? It's somebody who's well versed in the general area but not with the specifics of the thing that you're talking about. Another aspect of adapting your writing to the circumstances is paying attention to tone. You might think of just the distinction between formal and informal tone. Right? The way you talk to your best friend is going to be different than the way that you talk to somebody who's an authority. Okay, so that might be a difference between formal or informal and formal, right? You're going to be informal with your friends and more formal when you're trying to say something important to somebody important about something important. In academia, we generally prefer formal writing. Now that's a little bit less so than it used to be. We don't mind it being a little bit conversational now, but it shouldn't be so conversational that you would describe it as colloquial, which is to say the way that ordinary people speak in ordinary circumstances. We want it to be elevated in tone. We want to be using precise words that say exactly what we mean and which are of the right sort of caliber of words. You can find out a lot more about the difference between formal and informal tone in a style guide. But you can also think about it in other ways too, right? Sometimes when people write, they could be really friendly, or they might be really aggressive, or they might be really condescending. And those are all things that you can try to do. Sometimes they happen because it's just an expression of your own personality. But you need to choose your tone deliberately when you're writing for an academic paper. And your tone should be something that's straightforward, clear, serious, and trying to be as intellectual as you can. Speaking of all of these different ways of adapting your writing to meet your audience and your purpose and so on, you might have heard of this idea of genre, right? Different kinds of writing. The typical definition, at least that I found, is form plus content plus style is what gives you the genre. So the form might be a novel, the content might be science fiction, the style might be high or low or whatever you want to pick, right? So some combination of form, content, and style makes up a genre. And you can imagine recombining these things in different ways and you'd end up with different genres. So you might have the same form, a novel, right, but different content. Instead of a space story, a cowboy story, and you'd end up with a different genre. So that's similar to what I've been talking about with regard to purpose and audience and tone. The reason why you're writing, who you're writing for, and how you're writing to them you could think of that as defining the genre of your writing. Right? So something to remember when you're reading and when you're writing too is that genres change over time. Certainly the ways that novels are written now are very different than they were a long time ago. And even scientific journal articles are written differently now than they used to be. So you've got to be careful when you're choosing your role models that you're choosing something that's current. If you try to write like Charles Dickens, you're not going to do well today because even though everybody recognizes him as a brilliant genius writer, nobody writes that way anymore. All right, so just something to keep in mind when you're looking for your role models is that choosing the genre matters, and keeping up with contemporary or current movements is also important. Part of what's different between Charles Dickens and a novel written today are the conventions. So let's talk about conventions. This is something that's important for you to understand and get a handle on in your own writing. And I think the most obvious way to get a handle on it is to just think about two cases where the conventions are entirely different. Something like a graphic novel or a comic book versus, say, a science textbook. If you think about the experience of reading each of those kinds of work, it would be very different, right? A graphic novel is going to have much shorter sentences. It's going to be written in a much more colloquial style for the most part. It's probably going to have a lot of ordinary speech that's broken up by ellipses and exclamation points and so on. Whereas a science textbook is going to be written much differently. And it's going to be written in a higher style. It's going to be written much more objectively. It's going to have longer sentences and so on. Okay? Now, there are also going to be differences about the way in which the language is written down. Often in a graphic novel, the words look like they're handwritten. In a science textbook, obviously, they're printed. But even besides that, there are differences about line length, page length, the number of words on a page, the size of the font, the look of the font. All of those things are part of the conventions of writing. And in order to be successful in a given genre or field of writing, you need to know the conventions of that field. So what's relevant for us is that you learn the conventions of academic writing. Okay, so your task as someone who's learning to become an excellent writer is to know the conventions of the kinds of writing that you're working on. Now, the best way to get good at that, or to get good knowledge of that, is to read a lot in that particular field. In an undergraduate course, maybe in a general education course, you're probably not going to devote too much time to going out and reading the specialist literature in that field and really trying to absorb all of those conventions. Well, you should do some of it so that you get the idea for what that field expects. An important thing to keep in mind is that conventions are there for a purpose. They matter because they're a tool for communication. In particular, the conventions in a given context can enhance communication because the readers and the writers are all familiar with those same conventions, and so they don't need to perhaps go into as much detail, or they can explain things in different ways that the readers are going to understand. So if you think about a graphic novel, one of the conventions is that the words are going to be supplemented with pictures. Right? So you can tell how to read a phrase by looking at the character's facial expression or something like that. Okay, so the very same words might mean one thing in one speech context and mean something different in another speech context, and you can see that difference in a graphic novel because of the pictures. Well, that's an example of a convention in a graphic novel, that the words are relative to the pictures and you need both to get the full meaning. Obviously, in a science textbook, we don't have much of that, right? Or in a philosophy paper. So those contexts have different kinds of conventions, but they're still there for a reason. They're still there for communication. They act as a kind of a shorthand, and partly they act as showing that you're part of the club, that you know what that discipline is about. So that means that if you're failing to meet the conventions of the field in which you're trying to write, then you're going to undermine your reader's confidence. They'll think that you aren't worth listening to because you don't even know the basics. Okay, so although it can be really boring to try to make sure that your paper is written with 1-inch margins and 12-point Times New Roman double-spaced, with the paragraphs, the first line of each paragraph indented by 1/2 inch, and no spaces between paragraphs, and page numbers in the right places, and all that other stuff, right? If you're not doing all that, then you're undermining your reader's confidence. They think that you haven't even mastered the basics, so why should you be listened to? So if you want to be an effective writer, if you want to be an excellent writer, you do need to pay attention to those sorts of conventions. What makes it more complicated is that different disciplines do have different conventions. So you'll have to pay attention to the differences. If you're a psychology major or a criminal justice major or an education major and you take a philosophy class, the conventions are going to be different and you'll have to try to learn those new conventions. All right, so the way that you're used to writing in your own sort of home major may not be the best way to write for every class that you're taking or for every purpose that you might want to write. So that's, again, part of being adaptable and part of being able to communicate is knowing which conventions to use in which contexts. Now, I should mention that conventions include things like spelling and grammar and punctuation. Now, why is that? You might say, oh, that's really boring. Why should we care about spelling or grammar? Well, it's because those things are tools for communication. If your reader has to fight against your text, if they have to struggle to understand it, then the communication is going to be less effective than it could be. So if you know the correct spellings, or if you look them up, or if you rely on a spell checker or a grammar checker, right, and you make sure that your writing is technically correct, then you're more likely to be able to communicate well. All right, so any kind of writing is bad when it does any of these things listed here, right? If it defies your reader's expectations about how things should be written in that kind of field, right? In terms of language choice and even font and margin size and things like that. If you defy your reader's expectations, if you give them a graphic novel when they expected a scientific textbook, then you're going to be probably communicating poorly. Anytime your reader is confused by what's happening, either because of a spelling or a grammar mistake or something else, that's bad writing. If your readers end up focusing on the wrong things, right? If they see a few mistakes, now they're just looking for more mistakes. They're focusing on the wrong thing, or they're focusing on trying to decrypt what you meant, then they're focusing on the wrong thing, and so it's bad communication. In general, anytime your reader has to work too hard to understand what you're saying, that means that your writing could have been improved. So that goes across the board, right? In terms of clarity, in terms of style, in terms of organization, in terms of spelling, grammar, punctuation, and other conventions. Anytime your reader is working too hard, then you haven't communicated properly or not as well as you could have. So your job as a writer is to make it easy for your readers in the sense that they can focus just on the ideas and understand those ideas clearly and exactly. All right. Well, what does it mean to be a good writer? It's very hard to spell it out in detail because there are so many different contexts and so many different ways to write, and there's not just one single correct way to write. Different people have different styles and different ways of approaching things, and yet we would identify many different people who have different ways of writing as good writers. What we can say, though, is that there are kind of some universal standards that are ideals to which we should all be aspiring as we become writers and anytime we write. Clarity is obviously the most important. Clarity means that your ideas are clear, they're properly expressed, and that your audience can understand them. So clarity is going to be relative, right, to the subject matter, to the audience, and to the purpose for which you're writing. But in that context, you've got to find the right balance for making your writing maximally clear. Same thing goes for precision. That is, being as exact as you can be in expressing your ideas. Precision is partly about word choice. It's partly about how you write your sentences. It's partly about what kind of background information you provide, and it's partly about how you explain things. Again, it's going to be relative to your audience and your purpose and that sort of thing. But it's extremely important, I'd say especially in philosophy, but in all kinds of places, to say exactly what you mean. You might give the impression of clarity and yet not really be saying what you mean to say very precisely, in which case your reader might have an illusion of understanding, or they might understand the wrong thing. So to really communicate clearly, you should also be precise. Now, I think that another standard that everybody accepts is a criterion of good writing is brevity. There's no reason to say something in more words when you could say them in fewer. Now, this brings up an interesting point, and that is that clarity and brevity, precision and brevity, those things tend to pull against each other. right? So if you want to be really brief, the way to be most brief might be to be really unclear and to say things very cryptically or leaving out so much context that nobody can really understand you. So it isn't that you should have the briefest possible way of saying something. You should say the thing in the briefest way that you can while preserving clarity and precision. Okay, so those three things are the most important: clarity, precision, and brevity. I would add actually a fourth characteristic. It's very hard to define, but it's one of those things that you know it when you see it. And that is that if you express yourself well, it's not just clear, but it flows and it makes good sense, and it has a certain kind of specialness to it, right? Then it's elegant. Now that's sort of higher level, right? That's not the first thing you should be aiming to improve in your writing, but if you can, you want to try to do all four of these things. And if you can do all four of these things, then your writing is going to be really good. But again, they pull against each other, so it's always a question of choices. Writing is really about choosing, right? Choosing the next word, the next sentence, which order to put things in, right? And so it's about arranging and choosing and arranging things to make the best case that you can. And it's going to be a balancing act. And that's partly why they call writing an art, because it's not something that you just have a formula that tells you exactly how to do it. Along those lines, choosing and arranging, it's really important for us to emphasize rewriting as part of your writing process. It's just impossible to write something well without rewriting it. In fact, writing professors will tell you that most of writing is revising or rewriting. And when you see someone who you think of them as a great writer, they're probably actually a great rewriter. Almost no novel that you've ever read is the first draft of that novel, right? There's a second and a third and a fifth and a 10th draft. And it's that rewriting process that takes something that's a good idea and turns it into a great piece of writing. And that's something that you have to do in your writing as well. So when you're doing an academic paper, you're probably going to have a process that involves several different drafts. You can write a first draft, then you're going to write a second draft, then you might even write a third or fourth draft. It kind of depends on how important the paper is and how much time you have and where you're starting from as a writer. But rewriting is crucial for everybody because it's almost never the case that you get it down on the page correctly the first time. There's always a way to make it more clear, to make it more precise, to make it more brief, or to make it more elegant. And the goal should be to figure out at the end of the revision process whether every word and every sentence says exactly what you mean to say in the best way possible. Now, it doesn't have to be perfect the first time, right? That's an important thing to mention. This can be freeing for some people who feel writer's block. Sometimes writer's block comes from the pressure or anxiety of wanting to get it perfect. It really doesn't need to be perfect the first time because you're not going to submit your first draft. Your first draft is just getting something on the page. Then once you have something on the page, now you can work with it. Now you can revise it. And it's not so intimidating at that point, right? So just get something down. It doesn't have to be perfect. Don't worry about spelling and grammar the first time. But once you've got it on the page, don't leave it there. Now you have to manipulate it and revise it to make it as good as it can be. This raises a very important point, which is that you have to give yourself enough time to do a rewrite or several rewrites. It's especially true if you want to get feedback from other people, your friends or your colleagues or fellow students or the writing center or whomever else. You have to have time, right, to get that feedback and then to incorporate it into your final version. So it's always a good idea to make a plan for how you're going to do your academic projects, right? That is the kind of plan that a project manager would give. Not just that you're going to finish it on a certain due date, but that you're going to do this far in advance and then the next thing and then the next thing. Put in there some wiggle room in case things don't go properly. But don't forget that you need to also schedule time for revising and so on. So when you do a plan for how you're going to write an essay, include in it the amount of time that you're going to need for rewriting. I generally found when I was an undergraduate, and this depends a lot on your typing speed and how much practice you have writing in general, but I generally found that I could write about a page in an hour and it would be okay. And then I'd still have to do some revising of the whole thing, but that's about the kind of pace I think that you can expect to get to after you've had enough practice, right? But you've got to do the practice first to build yourself up to that speed. Now, when you're revising, what are your targets for revision? What kinds of things should you be paying attention to? Well, at least things on this list, right? In an academic philosophy paper, you're going to be arguing for a thesis. So you have to be stating a position. That is, you have to say that something is true or it's false. And you have to be taking a position that's at least somewhat controversial, right? There has to be a reason why we should discuss it at all. It shouldn't be something like the sun shines during the daytime, right? That's not controversial. Everybody knows that. So you got to pick something that's at least a little bit controversial in your topic area, but then take a position on it. You're not just discussing the topic area. You're saying that some claim in that topic area is true or that it's not true. Now, once you have that thesis, once you have that position identified, you have to figure out whether your thesis statement is as clear as it can be. If it's not, that's going to lead to big problems later. So really spend a lot of time formulating your thesis. That usually requires you to spend a lot of time reading the literature in the field and trying to get an idea for what kinds of positions people take, and then it has to occur to you what your position is. And that process can take a while. Sometimes you might not have an opinion, right? You might read a couple of things and say, gee, I don't know which is right. That's okay. For a philosophy paper as an undergraduate, you don't have to necessarily believe the thing that you're arguing for. Just pick that position and argue for it. Okay, so you might learn along the way that the position you took was correct, or that you might come to not believe it anymore. But you can take care of that during the revision process, and I'll say more about that in a little bit. My point for now is just that sometimes if you're not sure which position to take, just pick one. It could be the most popular view, it might be the opposite of the most popular view, just to challenge yourself to come up with an interesting account. Okay, so targets for revisions. Once you've got your thesis nailed down, once you know your position and you've made it as clear as possible, now you have to think about the organization of your paper. Think of your paper this way, as essentially an argument for that thesis. The whole paper is an argument trying to prove that thesis. And so the organization of your paper should be such that it makes the best possible case for the position that you're taking. Now I'll show you an example of a paper organization that sort of typical as a sort of a general model. It doesn't always have to be that way, but there are better and worse ways to organize a paper to make it as clear as it can be. Once you've got the organization in terms of the order of topics, now you have to think about, well, okay, is it easy to follow? Can a reader get from one idea to the next? Do they have the background knowledge that they need? Should I move something that was later to earlier to provide that background, and so on? Okay, so that's all part of figuring out your organizations, whether or not it really makes the best sense and makes the strongest case. When you're doing that part of your revision process, when you're revising your paper for organization, you need to also take into account that in your introduction, you probably laid out a path for how your paper was going to proceed. And in the conclusion, you summarized what happened in your paper. If you make these revisions in the organization, you have to make sure that you also make those revisions in your introduction and your conclusion, so that the whole is a unity. Okay, so it's not just a bunch of words, but that it actually fits. That's one of the things that's always frustrating as a reader, is to have your author promise to do one thing in the introduction, but then they end up doing something entirely different. And when that happens, what's happened is that it's an improper revision or an incomplete revision. Okay, so pay attention to that in your own writing too. Now the thesis and the organization, that's pretty high level, big picture stuff, right? But you also need to think about small picture stuff. Individual words, sentences, paragraphs, all of those should be as good as they can be. When I'm talking about picking just the right word, I mean using a thesaurus and a dictionary to express your ideas as perfectly as you can, right? To express that idea in the best possible word that means exactly what you mean to say. And then at the sentence level, making sure that your sentences express those ideas as clearly and as precisely and as briefly as you possibly can, hopefully also elegantly. And then at the paragraph level, you should make sure that each paragraph contains one main idea. There can be some subsidiary ideas, right? There's some things that go along with that main idea to make a paragraph. But generally, if you switch topics or you have a different idea, that means you need to have a new paragraph. So check your writing and make sure that your paragraphs are set up in the right way. I would say that there's a temptation to make your paragraphs long, as if that's a sign that you're thinking more deeply. But I actually think that shorter paragraphs are better. They're more effective. And if you divide your work up into paragraphs in smaller chunks, it's going to be more digestible for your reader, and they'll understand it better, and then you'll communicate your ideas better. Lastly, you need to check your paper to make sure that it meets the conventions of the field for which you're writing. So margins, font, word choice, spelling and grammar, all those things, make sure that they're all taken care of as you're doing your final revision. Now, how are you going to do these things, right? Now you know what you should be changing, what your targets are for revision, but how do you actually do a revision? Well, there's no one way to do it. Here are some ideas. Different people work in different ways. Different people find different things to be effective in this regard. And I would suggest that you try them all and see what works most effectively for you. I can tell you that today, even though I've been writing for almost, I guess, 35 years as an academic, I would say that I still use many of these methods of revision every time I revise something. So you can see the list there. I won't read it to you, right? But compare the first two bullets, right? Reading something quickly and reading it slowly. Reading it quickly can help you to see the overall structure, to make sure that the ideas flow properly. Reading it slowly can help you with words and sentences, and make sure that those are exactly right. So you need to do both of those kinds of things, and it's usually better to do them as separate tasks, okay, rather than trying to do everything in one revision pass. Focus on one kind of thing at a time. So if you want to focus on the big ideas and make sure that the flow is right, okay, do that in one of your revision passes. And then in a different revision pass, worry about words and sentences, then maybe go back into paragraphs, and then while you're going, you might notice spelling and grammar mistakes. You can fix those as you go, but then on your final pass, you should read for spelling and grammar. Okay, so those you're going to have to do multiple methods of revision, multiple techniques for revision to end up with a good final product. Now, there's a funny thing that happens, and that is that after you've been reading the same thing for a while, your brain starts to see what it expects to be there. And so a word might have been missed out, an it or a the, right? And your brain knows it's supposed to be there, so you don't notice that it's missing. One way to see that kind of mistake is to put your draft aside for a couple of days and then come back with fresh eyes. And with fresh eyes, you're going to see some of those mistakes that you were glossing over before. Similarly, if you read your paper out loud to yourself, you'll often hear things that you didn't see. It's a really, really effective technique. It's actually kind of shocking how effective it is. It's really a great way to figure out when your sentences are too long or if your sentences are not clear, is to read them out loud. And if they don't even make sense to you, the person who wrote it, then they're certainly not going to make sense to your reader. Finally, you can't rely just on yourself, especially as a beginner. As you're becoming to be excellent, you need to have some help. And so if you can, find someone whose opinion you trust and you trust their writing abilities and have them read what you've written. That could be a fellow student, it might be a family member, it could be just a friend, but have somebody read your stuff for you and have them point out when they think something isn't clear or if you made a grammatical mistake. This can actually be difficult if you're in a close relation with somebody like a boyfriend, girlfriend, or whatever, because they don't want to hurt your feelings, and so they might not tell you the truth. So be careful who you pick here. Pick somebody who's going to feel free to tell you the truth and tell you that things need to be fixed. And you should be open to hearing that advice too, right? So don't be resistant when people tell you that something should be changed. Now, not every piece of advice that you get is going to be good, right? But you should at least take it into account and think about it, or at least have a reason why you're not going to do the thing that they suggest that you should do. All right, so there are lots of other techniques for revision too, and you can find what works best for you. But if you haven't thought about this, then here are some ideas of things that you can do to help yourself be a more effective reviser. And after all, being an effective reviser is really what it takes to be an effective writer. Now, when you're editing or revising your paper, edit ruthlessly. Words are not children, right? You can kill them and nobody's going to put you in jail. And so even if a whole paragraph or even if a whole paper turns out to be junk, it's okay to throw it away. Now, you might end up in a time crunch if that happens too often, but if you give yourself enough time to complete a project, then you're going to be in a position to end up with a better final product because you're going to be willing to cut whole sections. Things that you wrote at first but which you now realize on reflection is not good enough. Right? So your aim is excellence. You want to have an excellent paper at the end. Your goal isn't to just preserve the work that you've already done. Right? So don't try to save what you've already written. Try to produce a final product that's excellent. And that will sometimes mean throwing out what you've already written and finding a new way to say what you need to say. So if a word or a sentence or a paragraph or even a whole draft isn't saying exactly what you mean to say in the very best way possible, then you should delete it or replace it. Think about if you were a coach for a professional sports team. If you had somebody who was usually a good shooter, but they weren't shooting well tonight, you'd probably pull them, right, and sub in somebody else and see if they can do better. The same thing is true in your writing, right? Just because something has worked for you before doesn't mean it's going to work in this case. And if something's not successful, well, just take it out and put in something else that can do a better job for you. All this is related to something in economics that they call the sunk cost fallacy. You might hear this expressed colloquially as throwing good money after bad. Right, just because you put a whole bunch of effort into something doesn't mean it's worth saving. You've already invested that amount of time in writing something. That time is already lost. Okay? You can't save it by spending more time trying to make something that stinks better. Right? Sometimes you just have to throw it out and start again. It's not a waste, right? You got practice of a certain kind. You learned something, presumably, and that's just part of the writing process. Sometimes things that you try just don't work, and you should just be willing to cut those things and to try something new. Now, even though I'm saying that you should edit ruthlessly and be willing to throw things out, I would recommend saving your drafts. Right? The way I do it is that I'll write a draft, save it as draft number 1, and then before I start editing, I'll change the name of it, save another version of it as draft number 2, and complete that edit, then save it as draft number 3, and then make new edits there. And that way, if I cut something out and I later realize, no, wait a minute, I still want that, I can go find it in one of my earlier drafts and transfer it to the final draft. All right, so that's just a technique for helping yourself to preserve things that you had previously cut out. Well, let's talk now a little bit more about the process of actually producing an essay. Now that we've got some background knowledge and some important ideas about how to do revising and that sort of thing, let's talk about the beginning steps rather than the ending steps. So before you do outlining, you will probably do a lot of research, because in order to properly outline an academic paper, you have to know what your thesis is. And you won't have a thesis until you've done some research. So a certain amount of reading, both in the journal articles or books that you're using, and maybe also in encyclopedias and dictionaries of philosophy and wherever else you need to look to get the background that you need to write your paper. Okay. Now, the first step in outlining your paper is knowing what your thesis is. Until you know what your thesis is, you don't know what you're arguing for, and so you can't create the outline. All right. So the very first step in outlining is to create your thesis. Now, it might happen that your thesis changes over time, that you thought you were going to argue for one thing at a certain point, but later you decide, no, that's not right, I'm going to argue for something else. That's okay. That's part of the process too. Now, different people do outlining differently. It's partly a matter of taste, it's partly a matter of habit, it's partly a matter of what you've learned to do. If you talk to novel writers, they'll talk about the difference between different ways of writing novels. Some authors are outliners, and some authors, they call them pantsers. They just write by the seat of their pants. And Stephen King is a pantser, and somebody, pick some other author there, an outliner. So the quality might be equally good, but in the end, what's important is the final product, right? Not how you got there. So how you get there is kind of up to you. I would say this though, there's a trade-off, right? If you do more outlining at the beginning, you probably will do less revising later. And if you do less work at the beginning, less outlining, then you're probably gonna have to do more revising later. That depends on your style, right? Depends on what you like to do, depends on how you work. But speaking from experience, I've found it more frustrating to try to revise something that's already finished rather than outlining a little bit more carefully. So, maybe you're somewhere in the middle, right? You're going to do a little bit of outlining, but not in great detail. And then as you write, you're going to change your outline. So that's an important point, right? Just because you have an outline doesn't mean that that's what your paper is going to end up to be. It could be that your paper ends up entirely different, because presumably while you're writing, you're going to be learning things. That's partly because you're thinking through these issues, right, in more detail than you have before. And as you're writing things down and trying to make them clear, you might realize, oh, the direction I thought I was going to go in is the wrong direction. I need to go a different way. Or maybe you're reading your sources in a different, more deep manner, and now you learn something new, and that changes your approach. It might even change your thesis. All right, don't worry about it. Your outline is just a tool. It's not written in stone. It's a ladder, right? It's meant to help you reach your goal. It's not chains to tie you down to something just because it was your first idea. So, however you end up doing it, whether you outline in detail or just in sort of sketch form, at the end, you're still going to need to do revisions. And as you revise the paper, right, you might find that there's a mismatch between what you put in your introduction and your conclusion compared to what's in the body of your paper. And if your draft doesn't achieve what you first set out to achieve, well, you have to make some revisions, right? And that could mean that you need to revise the paper so it matches what you originally had in mind as a goal. Or it might mean that you just need to revise your introduction and your conclusion so that they match the paper that you actually produce. Or maybe it's some combination. All right, so whatever it is, you need to present a unified whole at the end. And so that's one of the main important things about revising, is making sure that you have a unity in your paper before you submit it. Okay, so your introduction should have a clear thesis that explains the plan for your paper, and the body of the paper should prove that thesis, and then the conclusions should summarize what that paper showed. And it's got to be all one unified thing. Okay, so when you're outlining, what kind of structure should you be looking for? Well, again, this is going to depend on your purposes, your topic, the subject matter, right? There's all the particular thesis that you're taking. There's all kinds of different ways to structure an academic essay, but I want to show you one way that I think is a useful model, and you can sort of develop your own ideas off of this one, but try this one and see how it works. I don't know if you ever heard of this group called the Toastmasters. It's a voluntary group where people go to give speeches to each other to become more comfortable with public speaking and to get better at it. And one of the things that they teach you in Toastmasters is this, that when you're giving a speech, you should tell your audience what you're going to tell them, then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told. All right, so that three-part structure is really just introduction, body, and conclusion. You tell them in the introduction what you're going to be telling them, right? You say what the topic is, where your thesis is, the plan for the discussion, right? And then in the body, whether it's a speech or an essay, you actually tell them those things, right? You work through it in detail. And then you sum up. You have a conclusion in which you summarize or review what you did in that paper. Now, in academic papers, your introductions and your conclusions should be very brief. I think just 2 or 3 sentences. Different professors might have different opinions about this, but a brief introduction and a brief conclusion, in my opinion, are always much more effective. I would avoid very long introductions. In fact, in my classes, I'm going to tell you to not do that. But in general, I think the kind of long introduction you find in some, say, opinion pieces that you might find in newspapers or magazines are not that effective for proving something. Now, that kind of introduction can be effective in drawing your reader in, right, and making them want to read about that topic or putting them in a certain kind of mood or something like that. But those aren't necessarily the main things that we're trying to do in an academic paper. In an academic paper, you can assume that your audience is already going to read your paper. You don't need to convince them to read it. You don't need to motivate them to read it. You just need to make it as clear as possible for them to get your point, and you need to make your arguments as strong as they can be. So when you're giving an introduction, certainly in my classes, but I think in any academic class, absolutely avoid sort of flowery, vague, and empty introductions. Right? Don't say something like, "Since the beginning of time, man has asked why the stars spin around the sky." I don't know where people got the idea that that's a good way to start a paper, but it's complete crap. Don't do that. It's grandiose, right? It's trying to be more important and bigger than it is. I'm not trying to get you to discuss everything that happened since the beginning of time. I'm trying to get you to write a paper about a very narrow topic in philosophy, okay? So what happened since the beginning of time is not really relevant. Moreover, most of these claims, when people write these grandiose introductions, end up being false, because humans haven't existed since the beginning of time. So it's not true that humans have been asking since the beginning of time why the stars spin around the sky, or whatever the claim is that you're putting into your grandiose introduction. Right? So that's actually a really important point about academic writing in general, is don't write things that are false or that somebody could accuse of being unsupported. Just write clearly and simply and straightforwardly the things that you're trying to get to. Moreover, this kind of claim, this kind of flowery introduction is entirely irrelevant. It doesn't help you to prove your thesis, right? It's just sort of staking out a territory, saying this is what we're going to be talking about, and then you eventually state your thesis. Well, you don't need that. Just state your thesis. If you do this kind of introduction, it looks like you don't know what you're doing. It looks like you're an untrained writer or a bad thinker, so avoid it. I should also mention that almost all the time when I see these big, flowery, vague introductions, they include the word man in it somehow. Man has been doing something since the beginning of time or since the beginning of history. Well, avoid that kind of sexism, right? If you mean human or if you mean person, use that word instead. Don't use man to stand for all people. It's an old-fashioned way of writing that today comes across as sexist, and so you should avoid it in general, not just in these flowery introductions. So what should your paper be like? How should it start? The very first sentence should be one like this. In this paper, I will argue that, and then whatever your substantive controversial claim is that's informed by the literature, and then you should say because, and whatever the reasons are that that's your position. All right, so in philosophy, we don't mind if you use the word I. There are some other disciplines that insist that you use objective language. They think that using subjective language like I is a kind of bias. I think that's kind of silly because obviously you're the one who wrote the paper, right? You're the one who's arguing it. And pretending that it's objective doesn't make it objective. It's still your thinking. Anyway, in philosophy, we don't care about that. We use the word I all the time. And then what you have here is just a statement about the claim that you're going to be proving. Now that word argue doesn't mean discuss. It doesn't mean that you're going to be talking around. It doesn't mean that you're going to be looking at both sides. It means that you're taking a specific position. That's what I mean by something substantive as your claim. Right? So you're going to say, Dennett's argument about other minds is false, or has a false conclusion. Or the principle of sufficient reason is a requirement for all causal thinking. Right? Those are specific claims that you're taking a position about. You're not discussing, you're not considering, you're not doing anything else like that. You're taking a very specific position and you're going to argue for it because of some reasons. Now, obviously, in your first paragraph, your first sentence, you're just going to very briefly state those reasons. You're not going to give all of them, but you should at least give an indication in your first paragraph about the kinds of reasons that you're going to give to support your thesis. Now, you can, if you want to, break this up into several sentences. That can sometimes improve the clarity of the claim that you're making. Okay, so you could say, in this paper, I will argue that Dennett's theory of other minds is wrong. As I'll show, my argument is well supported because, and then give some reasons. And then next you can sort of describe how your paper will proceed. You could say, I'll make my case first by explaining Dennett's argument and providing some background. Then I'll give the counter-arguments to Dennett's position. Finally, I'll consider some objections and answer them. Right, so that would be a perfectly good first paragraph. Just 2 or 3 sentences. That's it. Nothing else. Don't tell me general facts about the whole field or about related ideas. Just get straight to your thesis, get straight down to business. This is an attempt to prove something. That's all it is. All right, so your introduction should be 2 or 3 sentences just like this, and then nothing else. And then in the rest of the paper, you just get down to the real work, right? It's the rest of the paper that really matters. Your thesis statement and your introduction sort of set things up. They tell the reader what to be looking for. They tell the reader what's going to be happening and how it's going to go, and that can be very helpful to them in understanding the argument. But remember that a philosophical essay is not a mystery novel. It shouldn't be a surprise to the reader what the conclusion is or why that's the conclusion. Right? The more you say up front about that in a brief way, the better your paper is going to be. All right, so in the body of the paper, that's where you really get down to work. That's the meat of it, you might say. And that's where you make your case. The whole of your body of your paper is about proving the thesis that you expressed in the first sentence of the paper. Okay, so everything in between the conclusion and the introduction is the body, and every single part of it should contribute significantly to proving your thesis. If something is in there and it doesn't contribute significantly to proving your thesis, then during your revision process, edit it out. It might be a nice point, you might like the sentence, but if it doesn't really drive the thesis home, if it doesn't prove the thesis, then edit it out, okay? So no fluff, no digressions, no asides, just get straight to the point and do the work. In philosophy, it's always better to go into depth on something narrow than rather trying to cover something, cover a whole bunch of things really shallowly, right? So narrowness and depth is way better than breadth and superficiality. Right? Superficiality is always going to be dismissed in philosophy. We want to do the hard thinking, we want to get to the real truth, and that means that we're going to talk deeply about something. That means in the limited space available in an essay, you can't discuss everything, right? So pick one thing, make sure that you right-size your thesis so that it's the kind of thing that you can discuss deeply in the amount of space available, so that you don't leave a whole bunch out and your proof is inconclusive, or you don't feel like you have to include so many things that you end up giving shallow coverage to everything. Now, I said I was going to give you kind of a plan for a body of a paper. There's no single correct way to do this, right? There's not a formula the way there is for a proof in mathematics or something. There's no single path from the beginning to the end, but here's a general pattern that I think is going to be pretty effective for your undergraduate essays. In the first part of the body, you can provide any background information. For example, if you're discussing so-and-so's argument, well, then you should explain so-and-so's argument, right? That could be a combination of explanation, paraphrase, and quotation, but the necessary amount, right? Not more than that. Only what's really needed to have the background for your audience to understand your argument. Now, you might also want to motivate the problem, right? Why should we care about this particular issue? And that could come before or after the background information. In most of your papers, certainly in this class, I would say that motivating the problem should be extremely brief, maybe a sentence, maybe two. Don't go into a long disquisition about it. If you find yourself writing a whole page about why we should care, then you probably haven't thought through your topic properly, okay? If you're going to be motivating the problem, that is explaining why it matters, then do that very briefly. And if you find yourself doing that at length, then that probably means you haven't thought it all the way through. And that's something you can revise out later. Now, most philosophy papers, it will matter that you're referring to the published literature. We're not just looking for your own ideas, right? Because people have written all kinds of things for 2,000 years in philosophy, and whatever occurs to you some Friday night is probably not going to be that significant. So you really need to bounce your ideas off the literature. You need to read and understand what's been written already so that you can put your own thesis into that context, okay? You could say, right, if your thesis is that, say, Dennett's theory of intentionality is wrong, right, that, well, there have been these X, Y, and Z other attempts to understand intentionality, and here's why they're wrong. Now, you're probably not going to go into a whole lot of detail about that, but it might be helpful or useful and effective in some context, depending on the length of the paper, to include some of that. Okay, so mention those other proposed solutions that you've seen in the literature, other ways of approaching the topic on which you are staking your thesis. Point 4 is by far the most important, and it should take up by far the greatest part of the body of your paper. In fact, if you did none of the other things and you only did number 4, then you would probably have a good paper. All right, but if you did the other things you left out for, your paper would probably be terrible. So the point of an argumentative essay in philosophy is to prove something, and to prove something you have to give evidence and reasons, right? Arguments. So that those reasons and arguments can come from texts that you read. We call that textual evidence, right? Paraphrases and quotations and so on. And you can also give your own arguments. Your arguments can be yours originally, or they can be arguments that you're getting from somewhere else. Don't forget that if you borrow an idea from somewhere else, you always have to give a citation for that. But that's the main point, right, is to gather evidence and arguments in support of your thesis. Now, it turns out that it's very effective rhetorically for you to also consider possible objections to the position and the argument that you've given. So what if you have a smart friend who reads your paper, right, and they disagree with you? What would they disagree about? Right, now, thinking about this can help you to sharpen up your own thinking. And so if you come up with a strong objection, right, then that's telling you something, right, that maybe your argument is not quite right. But then if you can answer that objection, if you can come up with a good response to that objection, then what you've shown is that your position can survive critique. In other words, it's solid, right? It's going to stand up to criticism. And that's showing that your argument is even better supported. I would suggest that in papers for me that you have at least one possible objection and a reply to it towards the end of your paper. That's a good idea. Now you can also do this along the way, right? For each of the small arguments that you're giving throughout the body of your paper, you might point out that somebody might object to such and such a definition or such and such an argument, or whether this premise is reasonable and so on. But don't go overboard, right? Just do worthwhile objections that make a difference, that end up such that the answers to them make your case more clear or stronger. Finally, we get to the conclusion of your essay. And again, it's just a few sentences. It's essentially the inverse of the mirror image of your introduction. Instead of saying what you will do, say what you did do, right? You have argued that your thesis claim is well supported by some arguments or evidence that you gave, and you can summarize very briefly how you proceeded. Now this should be very brief. I think only 3 or 4 sentences. Don't go longer than that. You don't have to summarize every element of your paper. After all, your reader just read all that, right? So the summary is kind of just pro forma. It's just to end things, okay? Just make it a couple of sentences, include your thesis statement again, and say how you proved it. Now, if there's some open questions that linger, you can mention those kinds of things if you want to, as long as it's not taking up too much space in the word limit. Okay, so that's the main thing, the main structure of your paper. It's this intro, body, and conclusion. Obviously, there's a little bit more to it since I've been talking about it for quite a while, but that's the basic thing. Okay, and if you can do that, then your paper is off to a good start. As I mentioned, whenever you borrow ideas that aren't your own from other places, whether it's from a book or an internet source or whatever it is, you have to give a citation. Now, the kinds of references that are allowable are going to be journal articles and academic books. Popular books, novels, newspapers, encyclopedias, and dictionaries, those might be places where you get ideas, but those aren't going to be sources that fulfill the requirements for having a certain number of sources. What I mean is that if you do get an idea from an encyclopedia, you should either try to find that idea in the original journal article or book, right? Or you have to cite that encyclopedia, but it doesn't count towards your source list, the number of required sources. Now, when you give references, use the author page method for in-text citations. Don't write P or PG or a number sign, just write the number. We all know that that refers to a page. And putting the author's name and the page number in parentheses tells your reader that you've just given a citation. And then how do they find that citation? Well, they look to your references list, or it's sometimes called a works cited list, depending which writing style or citation style you're using. And in there, you find the bibliographic information for every source, listed by the last name of the authors, arranged alphabetically. Now, depending on which citation style you're going to use, the structure of the bibliographic information is going to be different, and which kinds of punctuation you use where will be different. I don't care which citation style you use, just have to use one and use it consistently throughout your paper. So whatever the citation style is in your home discipline, that's what you should use. So psychology uses APA style, English uses MLA, other disciplines use the Chicago Manual of Style. History sometimes uses the Turabian style, which is the author of a style guide, a citation guide. Whichever one it is you're using, just use it consistently throughout. And when you're looking at the details here, make sure you're getting the format and the punctuation of your bibliography correct. All right? Now, there are websites out there that will help you. There are even some tools in word processors now. I've never found them to be very effective because I end up spending more time entering the bibliographic information into the tool than I would have just typing out the reference in the first place. That's kind of up to you. It depends if you're going to write a bunch of papers on that same source. Might save you a bit of time if you are. Now, if you need help with this, the librarians are great. They know everything about these citation styles, and they'll point you to all the right resources to help you to figure out how to structure citations and how to cite unusual things like newspaper articles or interviews or whatever else you might need to cite at some point. Okay, so you've probably noticed these cards in between different sections of this video today. This is an example of signposting. Now, back in the old days, before we had GPS systems and phones that had maps on them that we carried around with us everywhere, people got around by following signs. And if there were no signs, you would easily get lost. The same is true in an essay. If the author doesn't provide signs to tell you where you're going, then the reader is very likely to get lost. That means that the reader isn't understanding or the author isn't communicating those ideas well. So these cards that I put in between each of the sections are signposts to tell you, well, what's coming next. It tells you what we're going to be talking about. And that's the kind of thing that I want you to do in your essays as well. So just like in your first paragraph where you're going to give a brief couple of sentences about how you're going to proceed in making your argument, as you're going through your argument, you should give signs for your reader about what's coming and what's been going on. Right? So like I said before, academic essays are not mystery stories. The reader should never have to guess what's going on or where things are going. The point is to prove something, to reach a destination, right? So use signposting so that your readers know where to go and what's happening. That way they'll follow along and your writing will be a lot more clear. So when we write in this essay, I will argue something, right? That's an example of signposting. It's saying what the paper is about and what the reader should expect. And you can do the same thing at smaller scale in different parts of your paper. So you might start your second paragraph by saying, before I can give my argument, I need to explain what I'm arguing against, right? And I find a better way to say that, but you get the idea, right? So you're going to sometimes say, look, before I do X, I need to do Y. Likewise, you might say, now that I've explained Y, now we can turn to X, okay? Another kind of signposting would be inside a paragraph. If you're giving an argument, you could say, you're going to list 3 premises, first, second, third. It's gone out of style, by the way, to say firstly, secondly, just say first and second. It's always a comma after first and second and so on. And then at the end, you can say something about these 3 premises lead to the conclusion and give the conclusion. All right, so that's an effective way to let your reader know where the premises are, what relations they have to each other, and so on. In our lectures, I sometimes put arguments in standard form, and you can occasionally do that in a philosophy essay in the body of your paper, but generally that's not done. It's only in special cases that you'd want to do that. So writing first, second, third as sort of the markers for your premises is an effective way to show your reader exactly where those premises are. All right, so signposting can also guide your reader as you move from different sections, right? So you might say, now that I've given the background information, here's my argument. Now that my argument's clear, here's a potential objection. Okay, so do that along the way to just make sure that your reader always knows what's happening, right? What's the point of what they're reading now? Now, it's possible to overdo it, but you can take that out when you're doing your revising, right? Now, in revising, you might add in signposting, but you also might decide, this is too much, I need to trim it down. And try to find that perfect balance. A related point about signposting is that when you give a quotation, you can't just leave it there to speak for itself. You have to explain how you're interpreting that quotation and why it's important for the case that you're making. If you don't do that, you've left out the important work that you should have been doing. Right? That quotation is somebody else's writing, it's not yours. So if you use it, it's got to be an example, it's got to be something that's especially clear, or then you have to interpret it Okay, you've got to say what it means, why it's important, how you're using it, how it's relevant to the case that you're making. Now, don't go into too much detail about this. Often it's clear what the author means, provided that you provide at least some sort of explanation of how you're taking it. You don't have to repeat the quote or write something that's longer than the quote to explain the quote, but you do have to say something. All right, so we're getting towards the end now, and just a few things to watch out for, things that can trip you up if you aren't careful and you don't know to look for them. When I'm grading, the first thing I notice is that a paper doesn't have a thesis or that the thesis is unclear. And so the very first thing that you should be checking, in fact, it should be all the way from the outline stage, you should be making sure that your thesis is the best it can be. Make sure that it's taking a controversial claim, position rather, that it's clear and that it's expressed in the right way, that you're arguing that something is true or that it's false. Okay? So if you don't have a thesis or it's an unclear thesis or you've got a lot of rambling fluff in front of your thesis, those are really big problems that you need to fix before you turn in your paper. The next thing to avoid is unclear writing. And writing can be unclear for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes it's because the author hasn't practiced writing enough. Sometimes it's because the author's trying to say something really difficult and they haven't found quite the right words yet. But to the extent that you can, make your writing crystal clear. And if you can't get it crystal clear, that might mean that you need to do more work to understand exactly what it is that you're trying to say. So sometimes unclarity is not bad writing, it's bad thinking. Okay, so be careful about that. There's other problems here that I've listed. I've talked a little bit about some of them before, so I'm not going to read through all of these with you now. You can pause the video if you want to look at them carefully. But all of these are important, and at different stages of revision, you should be trying to look out for each of these kinds of problems. Something else to watch out for when you're criticizing somebody's argument is to make sure that you're not criticizing a caricature of their view. And make sure that you're accurately representing their view, and more than accurately, give their view and their argument a charitable interpretation. Make it as strong as it can be. That way, if you then defeat it, you've defeated something very strong, right? Defeating a weak argument is no big deal. So if you use the principle of charity of interpretation, what you're going to be doing is giving your target the benefit of the doubt and making the argument you're critiquing as strong as possible. That, in turn, makes your paper that much better. In a face-to-face environment, I'd use these marks when I'm editing your paper. If I'm grading your paper online, I probably won't use some of them, but if you see them, they're important indicators for you that you need to make changes in future work. And obviously you can read what these marks here mean. So you can pause the video and read these carefully if you want to. You could even write them down so that you know that these are problems that need to be avoided. And then if you see those marginal comments, then you know what they're referring to. All right, well, that's everything I'm going to say in this particular video. We'll be spending more time later in the course talking about writing. Obviously, that's a lot to digest, right? An hour and 40 minutes. So probably you'll want to watch this more than once, maybe in more than one setting. Maybe you'll just want to go back and look for something specific. For that reason, it's a good idea for you to bookmark it on your browser, create a folder or whatever where you put writing advice or something like that, and bookmark this so you can easily find it again later for our course or for other courses. If you don't do that, then it's going to be very difficult to dig it out of Blackboard, especially after the course is over. It's going to be hard to find it, so I recommend bookmarking. As always, please let me know if you have any questions, if you have any particular challenges that you're trying to deal with in your writing and you'd like help trying to solve them. I'd be happy to try to help you. Remember that although this is a serious and difficult process, it should also be an intellectual adventure. And so I hope you'll find some happiness and some joy in it, and that you'll find it fulfilling. My very best of luck to you, and I'll talk to you again soon.